Hello, friends. We're here today with kind of an interesting concept I'm going to start playing around with. I'm going to look at some budget starter decks to get people into the game of Star Wars Unlimited. I've seen lots of people have questions on how do I get into the game, what's a good, cheap, playable deck, because there's nothing worse than buying a starter deck, opening it up, and finding out that it just is not going to win you a game. Period. End of sentence. Not to say that the starter decks aren't worth buying, because I think in the right environment, the starter decks are good, especially playing against each other in a kitchen table environment. The starter decks are great, and if that's what you want to do, go for it. This video, or this line of videos, is more or less going to be keyed in at people that want to show up to a store tournament and win a couple of games. You may take down a whole event, probably not, but it is possible. So let's take a look at some decks. One deck in particular right now that I think that you can buy. I did the math on TCG Player, and you can buy this deck for $10 right now. It might cost you a couple more bucks here or there if you include shipping, but you might even be able to go down to your locals, and people will have these commons and uncommons lying around, and they'll help you out. Because that's all this deck is commons and uncommons. There's one rare in the deck, and we'll go over that. Actually, over half of the value of this deck is in 6 cards, and we'll go over that when we get to them. So first off, no surprise to anyone, we're doing Sabine Green. There's just so much value with these two colors, especially in the first 3 sets so far. So Sabine Wren, you can pick her up for nothing. She's a couple pennies. The only rare in the deck is Energy Conversion Lab itself, the base, and you can get this for $1.25. There's enough of these floating around. You shouldn't have a hard time at all getting your hands on these. So let's look at the card breakdown. We're going to run 3 copies of Spec Force Soldier. This is not a 1-drop. What this is a mid to late game drop when you're trying to close out and there's a Sentinel in the way. You probably never want to play this turn 1. This card isn't used in the more current versions of the deck because you've got other cards you want to play, but we're focusing on cheap cards. So we're going to keep that in mind. 3 copies of Rebel Pathfinder. It's not a great card, but the ability to get around shielded units is going to be huge. Most decks, in most matchups, this is probably going to be a resource, but it's going to be great to have it when you need it. 3 copies of Sabine Wren. This is actually the most expensive card in the deck. This one card is $1 a piece. So $3 in our $10 is tied up in this. I don't mind the $13 value up in the corner. That doesn't mean anything. 3 copies of Battlefield Marine. This is a card that you can feel safe to get your hands on now, because even if this is a budget version of the list, this card is going to be played probably for the life of the game. Well, it is a very solid, a 3/3 for 2. Even with no stats, this card's always going to be playable. Ketsu Onyo, I'm not sure if this card needs to be in here over Disabled Fangfighter, but we are going for cheap effects, and we're kind of more ground focused in this particular build. So I think this one's fine to run a 2 of. This is going to help you deal with some of those troublesome upgrade cards like Hotshot Blaster or any bounties you might run into if you're playing against Bosk. 3 copies of Fleet Lieutenant. This card is, played in the actual high-budget Sabine list, so this card is just fantastic. You're always going to be finding a way to run this. Fighters for Freedom. This card might actually not belong in this list because we are kind of running light on red cards. But I feel that a 3/4 for 3 that's a Saboteur, that's just a pretty good stat line, especially if we're going budget. And I think you would include this anyway. I could be wrong, though. Leave me a comment down below this video and let me know what you think. Sundari Peacekeeper. This card is normally in the sideboard matchup, but I figured since we're going budget and there's a solid chance we may be in an aggro heavy meta when we're playing this deck, I think why not just run a mainboard? This could be good enough. This could give you that edge in game 1 that you might be able to compensate for the fact you're playing with a budget deck. Because that's the whole point of playing aggro, is to catch your opponent stumbling. Catch them stumbling and get the win. So if you can squeak out some of those mirror matchups game 1, you're going to be in much better position going into game 2. Cassian Andor, this one is just a solid 3-5 for 3 that you can smuggle in. It helps take a decision that you have to make away from you, so you don't have to worry as much. You already know that you have something you can resource, and you've got a surprise 3-5 that you can bring in later in the game. Fantastic in the budget lineup. General Dodonna, this was played in some of the set 1 versions of the build, not so much in set 2, but we don't have the $7 a piece to spend on our red 3s right now. So we'll use General Dodonna, who's, he costs 1 more, but he's a 4-4, so those are great stats for a budget build. And he gives all your rebels +1/+1, which is slightly better than red 3. So I think this is going to be a solid pick, a solid upgrade over red 3. Right now, there's only one set 3 card that I'm including, and there may be more if I come back and decide to revisit this deck list, with Shock T. She's a 3-4 for 4, so not fantastic stats. She gives each friendly token unit +1/+0, and on attack, she creates a Clone Trooper token. So this is going to help you start flooding the board with units on turn 4. Actually, on turn 3, my mistake. So we don't have K2SO in this deck because he's he's a $7 rare or $5 rare now. Either way, so we'll run Shock T in his place. Not nearly as good as K2SO, but I think this would be a fine addition in the 4-drop slot alongside General Dodonna, because this is going to allow you to get that extra 3 points of damage in on your next turn, which could, in theory, get you the game. So I think this is going to be a fantastic choice. Our space units, most the set 1 builds will run Alliance X-Wing just because it's a 2-3 for 2 in space, and it's a rebel, so I think that's pretty good. We've got a playset of Green Squadron A-Wings. These are even run in the regular version of the deck. It's just too good. It's a 3-2 for 2. It's great stat lines. You're going to run it. Wing Leader, I think that Wing Leader is an even better play now that Boba Fett is gone, because we might not see the double yellow bounce decks running around quite so often, and there's no better feeling than playing a Wing Leader on turn 3 on your turn 2 Battlefield Marine. So I think this is always going to be in the deck. We've got a playset of Bright Hopes. It's going to help protect your space lanes. It's going to allow you to bounce units that have had bounties put on them. It's going to allow you to bounce any of your solid units that may have a little bit of damage on them. So you've just got so many options that you can use with this, and I think it's a really strong space card, and I would argue that if you're playing a green heroism deck, you're probably making a mistake if you don't include it. A Delphi Patrol Wing, we don't have Wreckers, we don't have Poe Damerons, so we're going to run a Delphi Patrol Wing. It is a 4-6 for 5, but when you play it, if you have the initiative, you can attack with a unit and it gets +2/+0. Actually, I think you get the attack option regardless of if you have initiative or not. So this is going to be a great way to help get that extra damage in on turn 4, because you're trying to close out the games as quick as possible. Now, I didn't include a few other options at the higher end of the cost curve because we're trying to get these games closed out as soon as possible. The longer games go with this style of deck, the more options you have for losing. So I think this is going to... Oh, I almost forgot to. We've got, for our 3 events, we've got Timely Intervention. That's the only one we're running. This is going to allow you to use it as a smuggle, and it's going to allow you to ambush in some units. Now, could we be using cards like Metal Ceremony? Probably. But I think with this style of deck, we want to play as aggressively as possible. So we want to have cards that hit the ground that are doing damage and then have an immediate impact on the game. Whereas Metal Ceremony, although a really good card, you have to wait for things to happen before it has the ability to have an effect on the gameplay. And I don't think that's what we want to do with this deck. I could be wrong. We may do some adjustments as we go through set 3, or maybe we'll move on to making new decks that'll be in the $10 range. So who knows? So thank you everyone for turning in. Take a peek, build this deck, and maybe hand it out to some local players who are just trying to get into the game at your local shop. So let us know what you think, and we'll talk to you soon.